Really excited to have Andy Galpin with me today to discuss all things muscle and how we can train optimally for it and really improve your results. So Andy, thanks for taking the time to be on the show.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
Andy, why don't you tell the listeners, if they're not aware of you or they don't know too much about your background, a little about how you got into the fitness industry, specifically how your path into science and becoming a researcher.
Yeah, I'll give you the quick one. You can ask me to expand if you like, or we'll stop. So briefly, I was an athlete all growing up in every sport. I played college football. I got my undergraduate degree in exercise science, master's in human movement science, and a PhD in what's called human bioenergetics, muscle physiology. So the last 8 years or so, I've been in my current job, which is at Cal State Fullerton. I run what's called the Center for Sport Performance. So we have a whole host of laboratories that study and produce and perform research to enhance sport performance. So I'm a part-time researcher. I study muscle very specifically in my lab. And so we do that actually at the cellular level as well as the whole muscle level. So we look at muscle biopsies, look at the individual muscle cells, and then also look at, did they actually get bigger or stronger? Particularly in the performance side of the spectrum, we don't do much clinical aging, disease, obesity. Like, we don't do that kind of research. So part-time researcher, I teach in the areas of program design, human performance, strength conditioning, nutrition. And then I work with athletes directly from a host of sports, but mostly combat sports. So boxing, wrestling, MMA, things like that. In the areas of their program design, they're optimizing their whole body performance, nutrition, kind of anything under the human performance umbrella. So that's the quick version.
Fantastic. Okay. So interesting that you have both the sort of scientific element and you're a practitioner, you work with people and combine two. And later on, I really want to investigate that a little bit more and how we can apply the science to our best practice when it comes to training. But what you're doing, some of the listeners, obviously they're blinded by science a little bit there, but they might be thinking, oh, there's loads of guys doing this. But that's really not correct, is it? You're pretty unique in exactly your area of research and how you guys are going about it over there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so, but I guess I'll leave that up to the listeners to decide how unique or not I
am. And what I was interested in knowing is how did your path getting into that, the niche that you've created and looking at things at a cellular level, how did you find your way into that specific area?
Well, the honest answer is probably like a lot of you listening. Whether you say if you have a degree in exercise science or something, or maybe you've just watched a lot of podcasts like this and you almost have kind of a pseudo degree in exercise science. I mean, I just remember sitting in those classrooms being 18 and, having a decent strength conditioning background. I started lifting weights when I was probably 13 or something like that. And back then there was no internet, so there was no podcasts. We had to do our best to scramble magazines and articles together and whatever we could find and dig up from the Arnold, encyclopedia. That wasn't even out yet actually when I started. But my point being, I remember sitting in exercise science classes and just being like, there's no way that what you're teaching me right there is true for, say, this type of training or this type of training. And like, well, what if you manipulate your rep scheme like that? There's no way to have the same adaptation as that. And just thinking all these practical strength conditioning questions and looking at the stuff we're being taught in the classes and going, there's no way. In fact, no one's actually done the research. All people have done have looked at 60 minutes of cycling versus strength training, and all strength training apparently is 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps. And I just remember thinking, like, this is so off. I want to know actually what happens inside the cell that allows you to say, do 3 sets of 10 or 10 sets of 3, and that's the exact same work. The muscle's contracting 30 times either way. How the hell does the muscle cell know? In one case to get a lot bigger, in another case to get, say, stronger or more powerful, but not necessarily get bigger. I just literally couldn't physically understand how that's possible when either way the muscle cell that doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have a processing, like it literally doesn't know. In your head, you're doing 2 different types of training, but how the hell does the muscle cell know at all? It just contracted 30 times. And once I learned about the all or none principle, it was like, well, they contracted 30 times as max as it could. So what the hell is possibly explaining how these things get too functional, completely different outcomes?
Mm-hmm.
That probably started all of it, man. And I just wanted to keep knowing, like, I just wanted to know strength conditioning questions. And I felt like what we were getting in our education was paltry compared to what we could know.
What the capacity was. Yeah, well, I mean, Sports science is obviously it's expanded and it's moving at a rapid pace, but it's small, really. I mean, for guys like yourself and people like me that are really interested, we probably think it's the world, but actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's very small. The funding's maybe nowhere near what pharmaceutical research or anything like that. So we're learning all the time, but there's still so much to learn. And actually,
well, no, compared to pharmaceutical, I mean, funding for sports science is statistically zero.
Yeah, yeah.
Like the actual statistical number would be zero compared to that. So
yeah,
you could say smaller, or you could say literally zero.
All right, we'll go with the factually correct, literally zero. Which is a great insight for people, because I think some people are under the misconception that we have it all figured out and we know exactly what we need to do, and it's a continuing journey, and we're making grounds in that respect. But actually, it's fascinating because literally one of my questions I had was, there's a functional difference between 3 sets of 10 and 10 sets of 3. But what is the physiological difference? Are you able to kind of walk us through a little bit how that difference actually manifests?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. First of all, we have to take a step back. I'm a muscle guy, so I tend to focus specifically on what happens in the cellular and molecular parts of the muscle. But we have to realize human movement requires many physiological systems. And so I think actually this is a mistake I have made early in my career, and even now, when I get asked these questions, my default is to just start thinking of the muscle cell. Mm-hmm. And I think if we really want to answer that question, we have to think about the entire body and all the systems that go into play with executing that, because the answer may or may not be in the muscle cell. It could be something entirely different. It could be an endocrine issue. Mm-hmm. It could be a host of other things. And so I'll plant a flag there in your head, and I'm going to walk away from that. But just keep that in mind, that's without question where the field is moving. Mm-hmm. And that's the demand where it could go, and that's going to give us, and I think that's going to solve a lot of our issues of conflicting research, is because we're too zoomed in, and reductionism is, in the hope of being specific, has caused us to lose sight of the bigger picture a lot of times.
Okay, interesting.
So, the best of our knowledge, okay, what's very clear is, in order for you to, say, grow a muscle fiber, so hypertrophy, increase the size of a muscle cell, there's a 3-part cascade that has to happen. Part number 1, there has to be some sort of signal. Okay, now this could come from something like testosterone, could come from simply the cell wall itself being stretched, mm-hmm. could come from a host of any other metabolic signaling issues. Lactate is a strong signal, and a host of other things. Okay, but some trigger, some signal. That signal then has to activate what are called signaling proteins. And the point of these are proteins that sit inside your muscle cell, and their whole job is to communicate the signal. That's what we call them, signaling proteins. Mm-hmm. One of the few times in molecular biology we actually give a fucking decent name for something.
Make it possible to understand, yeah.
Signaling proteins, there are thousands of them in terms of different types. The actual amount of them, who knows? Millions, probably, right? And so signaling proteins can convey any number of thousands of different signals. But in this case, we'll just say muscle hypertrophy, just to keep the concept going and to make it easier to follow. So some signal had to get there, and then the signaling proteins have to be activated. One protein activates another protein, and it's like a game of telephone. Mm-hmm. So I tell you, you tell the next one, blah, 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 and it kind of goes down the chain. And that's how we literally physically convey the message from outside the cell into the middle of the cell, which holds what's called the nucleus. So the nucleus is what holds your DNA, and it holds your genes, and it controls what the cell does. It tells it to replicate, it tells it to grow, shrink, die, repair, you name it. So those signaling proteins have to be activated. Then step number 2, the signal that it's trying to convey has to be large enough and important enough to convince the nucleus to replicate its DNA. Mm-hmm. Right. And why that's important is because replicating DNA takes a tremendous amount of supply. It's a very costly activity, right? You got to use amino acids that are available to recombine and build a new protein, and you don't have many of these amino acids, and they're very transient. They're hard to store, and so this is one of the reasons why you have to consume protein frequently, mm-hmm. right? And the cell knows this, and so it's just not going to give up this supply. And it takes physical energy. It takes literally a lot of physical actual energy. So it's very costly for the cell to go through this process. But if you do convince the nucleus to replicate its genes, then you'll actually go to step 3, which is protein synthesis. And this is when you take amino acids, you synthesize them, and you put them together. And we all know, we've probably heard this before, but you take a bunch of amino acids, put them together, you get a peptide. A bunch of polypeptides put together, eventually it's called a protein. So signaling number 1, gene expression number 2, and protein synthesis step number 3.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we have that foundation of what it actually has to happen molecularly, let's look at the actual question, 3 sets of 10 versus 10 sets of 3. Well, we don't have any very specific data on any of those steps that compare those 2 different training prescriptions. Even though I know tons of research show that the whole muscle outcome is clearly different, what we do have are a couple of things. From the signaling perspective, it seems to be that the type and the amount and the magnitude of activation of the signaling proteins is just a lot different between those 2 training paradigms. So, in fact, if you look at my research from 2008 or so, we looked at like 8 sets of 3 at 85% of a clean pull. We did a biopsy, 8 sets of biopsy, and then another 8 sets. So really it was 15 sets of 3. And we didn't have 3 sets of 15 to compare that to, but we had lots of 3 sets of 10. We had lots of 5 sets of 10. We had lots of 10 sets of 10. And ours were markedly lower for the anabolic signaling mechanisms, even though the same volume or even higher volume, etc. If you look at the gene and the protein, there's a little bit of data. It's not solid, but those would also indicate that pretty much the exact same thing.
Right.
And so I think it's clear from the physiological side of it, it's just simply activating to a different magnitude the mechanisms responsible to actually induce hypertrophy. So the counter to that is, if you look at like the 10 sets of 3, there are strong data that suggests the contractile abilities of the fiber are enhanced greater with that.
Yeah.
So your 3 sets of 10 are probably going to induce more cell swelling, more fluid shifting, and more actual eventual hypertrophy. It doesn't seem to happen with the 10 sets of 3, but the contractile properties, and so even when equated for size, so to get deep into the woods, just the molecular cascade that has to happen to contract the muscle fiber, that gets really enhanced, gets really sensitive. So the muscle fibers can contract with more force and velocity, even without changing its size, when you tend to do more strength. So it's not just a neurological issue. If you ever heard people say, well, it's all because of neural. Well, there is a neural difference, but it's not all the neural. The muscle is making very specific changes. And not to self-promote too much, but I actually have several videos where I go into this in more detail with graphics and animations if you want to hear kind of more about this. So I know I gave a long answer to that question. I don't know if you wanted that much detail, but that's why I'm playing the videos. Is I'll stop right there. If you want to see this stuff in action, you can check those videos out.
That's brilliant. Actually, yeah, I think that's a real great sort of teaser for people, and I think the videos will be helpful because people obviously, visual element will help them learn. Presumably, if there's some diagrams, etc., that will, if someone's kind of struggling to dot everything together and connect it up, that will help. So, guys, definitely go check that out after you've listened to this. So that's fascinating, and we got we really zoomed in there. And actually, what I want to do is maybe zoom back out, and then we'll come back in again. So there's some foundational sort of scientific principles of training that are probably to you seem blindingly obvious, but a lot of guys I think miss them. Can you give us a little bit of information about those, and then some real world examples of how they apply to different styles of training?
That's a big question. Can you give me maybe a more specific question off that, as a training outcome you want to talk about, or maybe because
so
that would be a whole class for me.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So let's kind of go from the ground up. Let's go with talk about specificity as first of all as a principle, how that applies to training.
All right. So I got it. So you're talking like just big general principles of overall strength.
Yeah, and then hopefully we can get those, and then we'll be able to pick out some details and zoom in on those from there.
Copy that. Okay. So yeah. I would say actually in my classroom, I've sort of boiled it down to just a couple.
Okay.
And I don't really go much past them. Number one, you've nailed specificity is critical. Now, I think what's interesting about specificity is we need to balance that. So the quick version is the fastest way to get a particular improvement is to train in that particular thing. So figure out what's failing and stress that.
Mm-hmm.
The body will respond exactly. So if your hamstrings are not strong enough, the most important thing you could ever do is challenge the maximal strength of the hamstring.
Yep.
Not the hamstring's ability to repeat submaximal for like 8 reps or 18 reps or 80 reps. It's literally challenge its maximum strength. How much maximum force it can produce one time. That's the most specific thing you could ever do. And we know that in general, specificity, the more specificity, the greater carryover. So the better the adaptation, the more specific, right? But on the backside of that, we also have what I call long-term development. So if you specify too much, you may compromise long-term development for a whole host of reasons we can get into. And so this is why we have this whole art of program design, right? Mm-hmm. Because if that wasn't my concern, if all I ever wanted to do was get my bench press up high as possible, I would literally just go to the gym, do a 1 rep max every single day. Well, that is great, but we've got enough evidence to suggest, oh, that ain't going to work. You can't just do that every day the rest of your life. And so this is why we have to balance the longer thing. So specificity is one. The other one really that I go after, for the most part, is progressive overload.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So we have to, at some point, overload in a progressive fashion. Overload can be a combination or a whole host of different things, including volume. So number of reps, number of sets, number of times you're working out. Could be the intensity, so the load, how heavy. It could be the complexity of the movement. It could be a combination. It could be reducing or increasing rest intervals, or again, a combination. So we get this question like, well, what should I do? Should I bump up the reps or bump up the weights or reduce the rest? Well, there's pros and cons to all that, and all of those would still represent some sort of progressive overload. That's the real key. And then to me, the third one is patience.
Right.
As long as you're actually giving yourself a reasonable time frame for adaptation, you knock out progressive overload, you balance specificity with general needs, and you have some semblance of patience. Most part, we're all going to be just fine.
Okay.
So those are the 3 big ones for me.
Fine. Yeah, I'd agree. I think, a great insight there and great description of them, and the order of them. And interesting that you mentioned patience, because obviously that's the one that probably people lack the most. And then would it be fair? I mean, we can't put obviously an absolute number on this, doesn't really make sense. But just to give them a guide, as you say, there's specificity and progressive overload. And if you are patient, and I suppose, of course, progressive overload takes care of hard work. But if you nail those things, perhaps 80% or something like that of your results are encompassed within those 3 things. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Maybe I would probably say higher.
Okay. So basically the message there is, though, that I think there's a lot of people, they try and be too advanced too soon, or they're looking for some kind of really advanced protocol to get them the edge. But basically the fundamentals done exceptionally well are what really matters.
Yeah, and this is funny because I remember someone telling me this when I was probably 22, maybe 21, 20, and I was a college football player. And I remember I can picture the scene. I can see his face. And I'm now going to say the exact same thing he said to me, and I did not listen to him when he told it to me. And it's like, no, you're not going to listen at home, but maybe one of you will, which is just because you can doesn't mean you should. So just because you put on 5 pounds every week to your bench press and you're still able to lift it, you probably shouldn't increase that fast, right? Just because your body's physically able to handle it. And one of the many reasons I say this, but one of them would be things like the muscle and, say, nervous system recover far quicker than the connective tissue does. And so you might be causing issues with the fascia, the connective tissue that surround your muscle fibers. That all goes into make a tendon. Tendon actually inserts in the bone. Tendons actually pulls the bone. So those things are not fully recovered typically as fast as the nervous system and the muscle and say your energy supplies and cardiovascular system, etc. The connective tissue is the last thing. And so that just needs far slower progressions than we typically think. So the patience part is critical. And I don't know anyone who is, say, over the age of 30 that has more than 10 years of training experience that doesn't go, man, I just wish I would have. And you know the end of that story.
Yeah.
I just wish, and it's never, I wish I would have lifted heavier faster.
Yeah.
It's never the finish of that story. So really be patient on those things. There's a reason we say things like don't increase volume by more than 10 or so % from week to week.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just not just because we're old and we're being dicks. Like, there's a good reason, man. Like, people have been doing this for a long time. We have a lot of data, we have a lot of experience, and it generally turns out, particularly if you don't have the help of exogenous hormone therapies, it's just generally not going to work out.
Yeah.
And you're not the special one. You're not the magical person who's going to get through it. Like, you're probably not.
Yeah.
I thought I was.
That's the sad reality. Yeah. And it, you know, I was in the same situation. Of course, I completely ignored the advice then, and we're, you know, hoping by putting this out there that, as you say, at least maybe one person will listen and take the advice rather than having to learn a lesson the hard way, which, you know, most of us go through. And actually, the fact you mentioned volume is a really interesting one, because, of course, you know, anyone that kind of reads around will have heard that, you know, in terms of hypertrophy, you know, more volume up to a point is better. And then I think people then jump to, okay, what's the absolute most volume I can handle, as opposed to, you know, gradually increasing and progressively increasing. And they're like, well, if more's better, I'll go in and I'll be doing like 40 sets per body part for every body part, you know, each week or whatever. And then, you know, from me working as a coach with people, explaining that process is quite difficult, of why, yes, you may eventually end up with this volume and that'll be great, but right now, this is where you need to be.
Yeah, I love the adage of, I remember being in college, literally flipping through Arnold's encyclopedia, and people being like, I'm going to go do this workout. And I remember thinking, well, that's fantastic, but you aren't right now where Arnold was when he did that workout.
Yeah.
If you were there, fine, but you're not. You need to do what Arnold did when he was in his first year of training, right? Mm-hmm. Even though you're 22 and he was 16 when he did that, or whatever he was, right? That's a major difference. So if you look at even the Soviets or any of the Eastern Bloc folks, and you look at their qualifications to be considered, say, intermediate, very few people that I know would even be considered intermediate, let alone expert.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of us are still in that first initial novice category. Like, even myself right now, again, I've been strength training for over 20 years. I wouldn't even consider myself intermediate at the current moment, because my fitness is, strength-wise, is not at those levels. Right? I haven't consistently trained heavy enough in the last, say, 6 months. I'd say I'm probably regressed back down to novice, and I will never, ever, ever, ever get to expert. Mm-hmm. I mean, I work with some athletes that I consider there, but even, I mean, I have some that are, several that are Olympians, world champions, and some of those I'm like, we're still maybe intermediate, even though they've been competing at the national level or higher for 6 years or so. So there, again, folks, there's a reason. Like, these people aren't just old curmudgeons, and they want to make you found and center figure. Like,
there's a conspiracy, right?
Yeah, like, there's a reason that if you're like, oh, I've been lifting since I was 18 and I'm 21, you're getting away with it now, probably because you've got some help in the endocrine system right now, but you're going to be paying for that in a few years down the road. Or simply, if you don't care about that, you're probably not optimizing your results.
Yeah.
That's the bigger thing you might care about. You're not getting the best results because you're not intelligently programming. And these old folks that are 30, 40, been coaching for 20 years, they've seen plenty of you 19-year-olds. They know what to do here.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's an interesting point. You mentioned Arnold and people doing his workout, and you know, if anything, they should be looking at what he did when he was just starting out. But realistically, you probably shouldn't even be looking at what Arnold did at any point.
Yeah, yes, for sure. Yeah, that's actually a very good point.
But you know, like at least go and where did he start? You know, and you know, pick an appropriate level that you are at within your with your career. So that's a hugely important point, and one that I'm sure people, again, it's one of those ones they'll probably ignore. But you know, when I was growing up, I was an aspiring rugby player, and if I could get my hands on the workout of an international player, that's what I was trying to replicate, which of course as a 16-year-old, 17, 18-year-old was pointless. But you know, same thing goes, I think, for guys trying to build muscle and, like, you know, copying their favorite bodybuilder's diet. It's just as senseless. But
don't do that. I've had conversations with my buddy Ben Pakulski, if you're into the body thing, you know him. Endless conversations with him in the last couple of years about this whole idea, and he's just like, Why would you ever do what I do?
Yeah,
like, you're insane. This is not going to work for a whole host of reasons. I mean, if you look at what his philosophy too, and a bunch of other people's, kind of going back to one of your points earlier, the volume thing is not a winning game. It's a losing game. You need to be thinking about if say muscle mass is the ultimate goal here, or physique or whatever. you need to be thinking about the quality of the execution rather than did you hit the number on the board, hit the thing here, because really we're using the weights or the reps, the volume, the intensity as an external stimulus to cause an internal adaptation. So the external stimulus literally doesn't matter. And if you look at, say, the research in the last 5 years on internal versus external focus, it's starting to become very clear that the actual control and the focus part matters a decent amount. And so you could do the same amount of, say, growth or less with far lower volume for lower weights if you're concentrating more on the muscle. If you're being more diligent with the quality of the repetition, the technique, you'll actually get more growth that way. So it's are you playing the long game or are you playing the short game? And that's you really should be focused on.
Absolutely. Actually, Rich, so interesting you mentioned Ben Pakulski, because last week I interviewed a guy called Michael Goulden, who is one of the guys who leads the RTS, resistance training specialist coaching over here. And I know that's quite influential on Ben's approach to exercise execution. And in many respects, you can get like the most from the least almost with their their execution and the quality of the rep. Every rep is a growth opportunity, and you'll be getting more per rep. Following those approaches. So I think that's another valuable resource for people to go and check that out. And then you talk about
that was in your previous episode.
Yeah, I interviewed a few guys last week. He's one of the guys from last week. So it's,
you guys are gonna have to go back. Stop this right now. And go check that one out if you haven't already. It sounds like amazing.
Yeah. So it was really, really good stuff. Fantastic insight into basically exercise mechanics, and that actually raises a point for me. There's two things I want to. First of all, we'll look at this, and as the point of a researcher. Now we get these numbers come out from all the research about volume and etc. But how closely is exercise mechanics actually coached and execution within those studies? Because of course, someone with better execution and half the amount of volume we don't know, but may get better results. And so I think that's a really interesting thing for us to look at as guys in the gym that just want the best results. What's going on in the research, and how much coaching are they getting?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. It really depends on the laboratory. And I would say that if you look at, say, what we do and some other labs that I can name, we spend an exorbitant amount of time on trying to ensure quality control there. I mean, we just spend a huge amount of time with the folks that are in the room, and we're going after them. The actual subjects in the study sometimes don't always feel that that's important. They're there for the workout, right? And you're constantly trying to get them to stay focused. But whether or not they're actually focusing their mind on a thing or not, I mean, we'll never be able to really know. Mm-hmm. I know that Brad Schoenfeld spends a decent amount of time training his students up. But once you leave, I would say the researchers that, I don't know how to say this without insulting them, but that aren't really from strength and conditioning, I don't know. I strongly question that stuff a lot of the times, because I'm like, I think you wrote the program. You had an undergrad student sit in the room while these people worked out, probably texting on their phone the whole time. And it's like, checked off the check mark. Yes, they did their set of 10. Yes, they did their set of 10. And this is the load they put on. And I know that happens in several places. So I don't want to say our stuff is better, but I think you bring up an extremely valid point that I don't think a lot of people talk about, which is actually, I think, for you listening at home, that I don't want you then to take that and think there's less credibility in these studies, or think, only things that come out of Andy's lab or Brad's lab are good ones. No, that's not true. But what I do want to emphasize from this point is this is why people like me and Brad continually say things like, well, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Just because one study found something and you read the abstract, or even if you read the paper, there's just a lot of layers, right? You're not an expert in research unless you're actually in the trenches like I am. Just like I wouldn't call myself an expert in coaching because I don't coach people full time, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm certain you know more about coaching than I do. So, this is why we say it. Like just because we have one study that says, hey, volume is optimized here. well, let's see it replicated 4, 5, 6, 7 times
Yeah.
and a bunch of labs, and then I'll start to be like, okay, I think this is the optimal volume range, or this is the optimal thing. Like, let's see it replicated in different men and women. Let's see it replicated people who have 1 year of strength training versus people with 8 years of strength training experience, and let's control for this and do they control for that, and you just start adding layers and layers and layers and layers, and you see where it sifts. But you got to be very, very careful about a single 2, 3 studies, or even a meta-analysis. If the meta-analysis, if you're familiar with those, when the meta-analysis is like, yeah, we examined 85 studies, but actually only 4 fit our criteria, so here's our meta-analysis on those 4.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
well, that's not really a good like, that's not a good thing to do. I hate those, but
yeah. Okay, yeah, that's an excellent point. I think the key is, as you say, is if one study flags up something completely different, maybe you should be open-minded but skeptical of that.
Yes.
Yes. And then these things, it seems to me, they tend to come out in the wash. Average over time. Give it enough time, and there'll be enough studies, and then you'll see where do most of these things cluster around agreeing upon a range, of course, but within a relatively narrow band, and that's probably some good takeaway guidelines to go with, rather than looking for the extreme outlier and being like, right, that's the secret.
Yeah, totally. You said it perfectly. I'm not going to continue. Good job.
Okay. Thank you. So now I want to get back quickly to the second point I was thinking about with this and volume with people's execution. So I think in some respects progressive overload was a problem for guys gaining muscle because they applied it purely to weight on the bar, and I think that ended up being a problem for people in some respect because they started chasing load on the bar at the expense of volume. Now, the other thing is now, because of these volume guidelines and the increased research, I wonder if people are almost doing themselves a disservice by chasing volume. It's just a different way of chasing a number, and quality of muscle building stimulus is not increasing just because they're doing more sets and reps. Is that a problem?
I think you nailed it. I don't know how I can add to that really, but other than clarifying that, yeah, I think you're right on. If you look at one of the things we're trying to figure out are what are the exact specific stimuli to cause muscle hypertrophy. And it's contentious at best at this point. We really don't know. About the time we feel like we got a handle on it, things just continue to get shaken up. So one thing I can say, though, is I am still a firm believer. And I know Brad, I've mentioned him several times. Consider him a good friend. We've worked on several projects. We're collaborating right now. I don't think sets of 30 are ever equal to sets of 8 or so or 10 for hypertrophy in the global sense. Right. I'm not questioning his research, but tension is important for hypertrophy. You have to have intensity there. And so to me, I think, can you go through phases of your training, say a microcycle, maybe even a mesocycle, where you get really high volumes, sets of 20, sets of 30, sets of 50? Yes. And I think that's actually a good thing. I think it's a very good strategy for people. I don't think you should be doing 8 sets of 12 or 8 to 12 reps per set ad nauseum, right? For infinity. Like, that shouldn't be your only prescription. But I don't want you to spend your whole time doing sets of 30 and forget about, hey, you know what, those sets of 5? Those are very, very helpful too. And if we look at, in fact, one study we're trying to collaborate on is people have talked about for years that higher rep ranges will enhance hypertrophy of the slow twitch fibers, but lower rep ranges target the fast twitch fibers. Well, right now, that's complete bro science. And not to say it's wrong, because I'm a defender of bro science. The bro science is usually right more than it's wrong. But I just say bro science in terms of this is things people talk about in the gym or in the magazines, but there's no actual science behind it. Well, this is one thing we're trying to get funding. We've been trying for 2 years to get some funding to actually execute this study, because it's very easy for me, actually. It would be fairly quick if we can find just a little bit of money. If that were to come out and to be true, then I would say, actually, this is why you should have a little bit of both if you're trying to maximize hypertrophy, is you want to equally train. If it's not true, then I think we can come back and say, hey, look, there's other things you should then can be considering when determining your volume intensity. And so I know I went a little bit off the primary point here, but I thought of that because I'm thinking, yeah, like, we shouldn't only be doing those really high volumes, whether we're talking about reps per set or actual total volume, because that's going to negate the mechanical tension. And the stuff in the last, I'd say, 2 years has really come out to show mechanical tension is probably a bigger issue and probably more important than any of the other factors at this point. So don't forget to go heavy, even when growth is the goal.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. So you've talked about tension there, mechanical tension, and Brad. So I think it makes sense to briefly cover the mechanisms of hypertrophy to make sure everyone's on the same page there, and then we can go over. So if you could quickly give us a rundown of those. I mean, obviously Brad's 3. If there's anything else you think is particularly pertinent, add those in.
Yeah. So Brad had a really nice article in 2010, I think, and he said, hey, right now there's 3 potential mechanisms that cause muscle hypertrophy. And again, assuming young, healthy, strength trained, like throughout cancer patients and kids and stuff like that, right? So one of them would be metabolic stress. So this is the burn, right? The pump, the lactate, this is all that stuff, right? The other one would be mechanical tension, which would be heavy. And 3, muscle damage. So initially it was like, hey, these 3 are important. And where the metabolic stress piece jumped in is when you started looking at all the blood flow restriction or occlusion research, and you're like, hey, this stuff is not actually causing any damage, and there's no tension here, but how the hell are you getting huge hypertrophy from blood flow restriction? And that's when the metabolic stress piece kicked in. Having said that, since Brad really postulated this stuff, we have actually, not me, but many scientists have looked into these 3 areas, and I'd say the last couple of years, it's really settled to look on things like, okay, well, say metabolic stress is a possible inducer of hypertrophy. It doesn't look to be nearly as potent as mechanical tension, particularly in trained people. So while blood flow restriction training might be equally effective for your mom or an astronaut or coming back from injury, probably not the case for a young, trained, healthy person. You don't need to go out and buy a KAATSU device and just probably need to do your normal training. It's nothing probably magical, unless you're looking just to change things up or have fun or something like that. It's not a piece you have to include in your training. So I say that to all say, it may change in another year or 2 or 3. This is something we're definitely trying to figure out as a collective group of scientists at this point. Don't know what's going on. Just to polish this off with the DOMS, the muscle soreness issue, there's been known for quite some time that there's really virtually very little relationship between the amount of DOMS, or the amount of muscle soreness you get from a workout, and how much you grow. And so maximizing your soreness, thinking that maximizes your growing is not a good idea. And there's a very poor relationship there. In fact, I would argue it's a negative curve, because the more sore you get, the less likely you are to be able to train again, to have a quality workout, and that seems to be more important. So probably a little bit of tight, a little bit of stiff, for the most part, is okay. You can't be so easy that there's literally no metabolic damage, there's no muscular stress, there's no issue, but it can't be so hard that it compromises quality. So probably in the medium range. Mm-hmm. So that kind of led me back to the mechanical tension issue by saying, like, right now it looks like that's really the base of the pyramid, with metabolic stress and damage being inferior and probably a higher, up on the string, some relevance, but it's not particularly clear which one's most or to what magnitude.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so from sort of a practical standpoint, I remember Brad's research coming out and then thinking, right, well, I've got to specifically train people for all 3 of these if they want to maximize size. And I found that actual real-world results weren't improved, but then also everything works but doesn't work forever. So the use of those high rep sets can be beneficial, but they're not all of a sudden it wasn't like I have to always be doing high rep sets as part of my workout. And what I found, again, when I'm trying to work with people, I'm trying to give them those guidelines was, 80% of your results come from mechanical tension. When you're doing that, 6 to 12 reps most of the time, maybe 2/3 of the time, but 5 reps or less can work, and 15 reps plus can work too, but they only make, whatever that leaves percentage-wise, like 10% of your training. Yeah. And those kind of guidelines.
I think those numbers are actually really good. I think that's fantastic guidelines.
Okay, so it seems like you're in agreement there, so that's great. So we're happy with that, and we won't sort of beat that to death. So one thing, though, it would be pointless having you on here and not discussing is fiber types and, basically getting a little bit in depth on there, because obviously this is an area of interest to you. You're doing some fantastic research on that. And could you give us a little bit of insight into it? And maybe we'll be able to take some practical guidelines away from it. But if we work on the basis that most people are aware of, there's slow twitch and there's fast twitch, and that's where most people are at, enlighten us a little bit from there.
Okay, big area.
Yeah.
See which way you want to navigate.
You got 2 minutes. Go. No.
I'll do it in 1.
That's what I like.
That's true. There are fast and slow twitch, but there's also what we call hybrid fibers. So you have individual muscle cells that are part fast and part slow, or anything else, a combination. So really, if you want to look at it more accurately, fiber type is a spectrum. On one end, it's extremely slow, and on the other end, it's extremely fast. And then you have a whole bunch of fiber types that run that gradient in between. And one of the other things that we know, for example, we just had a paper come out about a week ago where we biopsied a bunch of people from our Olympic and world teams in the sport of Olympic weightlifting. And we compared those to folks that are on our national but not international teams. And we start looking at fiber type profiles of different athletes, and some of them do land as you would predict, but many of them don't. And the shaved off answer here is the methods that we've used to quote unquote do the fiber typing research have been known for quite some time to be very, very poor. So it's fine if you want a very global answer, right? But if you want a specific detailed information, we basically have to start over. And so because of that, we know actually very little about anything from the anaerobic, that's what I call anaerobic. So strength, power, hypertrophy, like any of the strength training aside, we know extremely little information about the fiber type of these people. So I don't really know what the fiber type composition of, say, high-level bodybuilders is. There has been some research from a colleague of mine, but from the 1980s, and that doesn't mean it's wrong, but that particular instance, the methodologies were primitive, right? That's all they had at the time. So I honestly don't know. We have virtually nothing on powerlifters. Until this, my recent survey, we had nothing on weightlifters. Almost nothing on football players, nothing on basketball players. The anaerobic side of the equation just omitted. So we don't really know what happens there. And what we do know, though, is the fiber types are extremely plastic. So what I mean is they change, and they change very, very rapidly, and they change in response to a whole host of things, and they change in any and all directions. So you can go from fast to slow, slow to fast, up and down that spectrum. If you do more plyometric, speed-based training, you'll get more fast twitch fibers. If you do more, the traditional endurance stuff, you'll get more of the endurance fibers. We see fibers change in as little as almost 2 weeks when you give them extreme, say, unloading or interventions like that. We also see the rate of change in fiber type slows down as you become more specifically trained. Basics is right. If you're 10 years into your lifting career, your rate of improvement in strength gets really slow. Same thing with fiber type, right? If you're untrained and you start working out, we see huge changes in fiber types in a few weeks. But if you've already been training for 5 years, then the rate of change really slows down. So it's just the muscle being more and more specific, like we talked about earlier, to the demand imposed on it. Nothing novel there. And then the final piece I'll add before I stop is, again, we know that strength training has a very particular influence on how these muscle fiber types change. Typically what happens is the hybrid fibers go down, they become reduced, and they start to differentiate into the specific adaptation of the stress you place on it. So the hybrids go away, and the pure fast twitch fibers increase, typically with strength training, because you're giving it a demand. And I think what's interesting in a whole host of areas moving forward are two things. One, I'll plant a little seed, but I won't come back to it. We now have probably 25 or 30 different non-exercise factors that influence your fiber type. So everything from leucine supplementation, BCAAs, protein, high-fat diets, hypoxia, vitamin D, polyphenols, resveratrol, apples. All of these things have been shown to cause changes in muscle fiber types. The problem with all that, it's very little research in humans. So most of that has not been demonstrated in human yet, but some of it has. So I'll leave that aside as a teaser, intentionally not going to answer that. I don't even do a follow-up on that one. But I do want to bring this up because you will particularly care about this. So one thing I've been shouting for years now is I think that we can use fiber type to determine things like responders versus non-responders. And so I'm not really a believer in those terms. I just feel like it's not that you don't respond to training, it's that the program you tried isn't the best for you. So we need a different volume. You need more volume. You need less volume. You need more intensity. You need less intensity, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Cody Hahn, I'm not sure if you've spoken to Cody yet. He'd be fantastic to have on.
Okay, fantastic.
Haun. He just finished his PhD at Auburn with Mike Roberts, and he just released 3 studies showing some really amazing things. Study 1, he showed sarcoplasmic reticulum actually is happening, or sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is actually happening. If you have no idea what I mean, just move forward. You can ask Cody about it, but if you do, that's something that's been bro science for years, and he actually developed a method because we've never been able to measure it, and showed maybe that's actually a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
Study number 2, study number 3, super interesting stuff on how muscles are actually growing. But his 3rd study that came out in the last couple of days showed that if you categorize people by their fiber type composition, that actually predicts who will respond best to hypertrophy training.
Wow.
And so this is, I mean, that's the first paper, it's there, but this is exactly where the future is going, is we're going to be able to start figuring out, instead of just giving everyone the same program and then when it's not working, adjusting, we're getting very, very, very close to being able to get specific and precise with individual training recommendations based on physiology. And with the supercomputer and AI stuff that we have going now, this is something that's going to be extremely possible in the next couple of years, not 30 years.
Wow.
But a couple of years. And Cody also released some stuff on biomarkers, same thing that we can predict. And so as a field, we're getting much, much, much closer to these things. So that's really where we're at right now.
Well, that's super exciting. So, question for you. So, if you're analyzing someone's fiber type, how do you do that?
So we have to take, at this point, a muscle biopsy.
Mm-hmm.
So we take a piece of their muscle and we analyze it in the lab in a bunch of complicated ways. But I've been working on something the last couple of months. There are now about 20 papers, 20 studies that have been able to estimate fiber type based on non-invasive methods. So things like MRI, things like ultrasound. They're not particularly validated yet. And I think most of them are just pure wrong and they're super crude. But I have no question at all that within a few years we'll have such good imaging technology that we'll probably be able to put a cell phone up to your leg and get an accurate reading of your fiber type with just your camera phone. Yeah. It's not even close there yet, but the way that we move, it's going to happen. And the reason this is moving is, if you care, if you're like, what the hell, it's because fiber type is so critical to aging. It's the number one issue with sarcopenia is you lose your fast twitch fibers. And sarcopenia is this debilitating issue with aging. You lose muscle mass. And the loss of muscle mass is almost entirely explained by fast twitch muscle fibers. So understanding why those things go away and how to prevent that is also why strength training is by far the biggest way to deter sarcopenia, right? And it's most effective countermeasure for it. So because there's such a huge need for that, also kidney disease and kidney failure and aging, I think we're going to have some imaging for it soon. It's nowhere near there yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if in 5 years it's here.
Yeah. That's so exciting. You literally got me sitting forward in my seat, kind of listening for more there, like, literally on the edge of my seat. And I think I was going to say, do you think there'll be a point where we can use our phones to do this? Because obviously we need it to be accessible for people and cost effective. And so let's hope your prediction's right and that they get there quickly. A slight aside, but still a fiber type question. It's one I remember I wondered about a long time ago. If we knew someone's fiber type, people would say, "Oh, well, you should train them specific to that fiber type." And then I was wondering, if a muscle's predominantly, say we go like really, really broad, it's predominantly fast, and we focus on therefore explosive, low rep, high intensity. I always wondered, is that actually going to get the best outcome, or are we still better training it at something that's in other rep ranges, maybe something that challenges it and it's not so predisposed towards. So I can tell that's got you agitated and fired up. So go ahead.
Yeah, despite your subpar physical appearance, Tom, you're actually pretty sharp upstairs.
I don't know about that. No one has ever suggested that before, but I'll take it.
You're a beautiful man. I promise. Don't worry. Inside and outside.
Anyone that's watching this knows that's not true, but hopefully all you listeners just picture a Hollywood star. We'll go with that.
Yeah. Good full long head of hair. Just amazing.
Yeah.
All right.
I wish.
Boy, you brought up a really sneaky, interesting concept that I'm kicking back on, and where this gets brought up a lot is when commercial DNA testing kits try to tell you what to do with your training. So in other words, I got my DNA tested and it told me I'm X, therefore you should train this way. Terribly stupid idea.
Mm-hmm.
Just a terribly stupid idea. It would be the equivalent of saying, oh, hey, I found out I'm a girl, therefore I should just jog.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, I found out I'm a guy, I should only do squats. Like, what? This is insanity. With how much we know about individual variation and goals and age and all the stuff that go into making you unique, and you're going to determine how you work out based on one thing, super short-sighted. I don't blame the companies for doing it, but I blame people. Why would you listen to such nonsense? It's like, oh, I have brown hair, I should only eat apples. What? So, first of all, those things don't actually tell you your fiber type at all, not even close. Not even remotely close. But even if they did, let's just say they could give you a perfect optimal thing of what you are. I don't know if you are predominantly fast twitch, whether it's better for you to then train in, say, sets of 5 or lower, or you should do the exact opposite because that's your weakness. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't work with any physique competitors. I work with only competitive athletes. But from my perspective, I can speak on it. That's something I always go back to the coaching staff and the athlete with. So I'll go, hey, look, you're 85% fast twitch. Here's what that means. You're going to be extremely explosive, etc. This is also why you're having a hard time recovering. This is why you can't handle as many practices a week as your teammate does. This is why you have to taper more aggressively, and they don't have to have so much to taper, etc., etc. Okay. Now, you have to make a strategic decision, right? In my word, I work with a lot of UFC fighters. If one of them comes in and is a huge knockout artist, and they knock everyone out, but they gas, or they're terrible at wrestling, and they gas out. That's a coaching strategy to say, okay, well, what are we going to do? Do we want to spend the next couple of camps trying to fix your wrestling? Or do we want to say, fuck it, we're going the opposite direction, and we're going to be so good at knocking people out that, like, that's just what we're going to hedge. In other words, what I'm saying is, do you maximize your strength, or you try to shore up your weaknesses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's not a physiology question. That's a strategy question. That's a coaching strategy question. And I can't tell you. So do you want to play to your strengths, or do you want to play to short weakness? We don't have an answer there, and we certainly don't have any training answers there. There has been one really neat study that was done, I think. I'm blanking on the research team that did it. But what they did is they looked at these genetic markers for fiber type, and they had 4 groups. This sounds kind of wordy, but it's actually a pretty simple idea. And so they said, okay, the fast twitch group and the slow twitch group, and we'll split those into 2. So the fast twitch group got fast twitch training. The other half of the fast twitch group got slow twitch training. And the slow twitch people, half of them got fast twitch training, and the other half got the opposite, right? So you have 4 groups, 2 that were matched for their, quote unquote, they trained more like their fiber type, and the ones that got the opposite. And in both groups that got the appropriate training based on their fiber type, both of those groups saw enhanced adaptations. So that would indicate they responded better. Mm-hmm. But I still question the conclusion, because yes, you seem to respond better to that type of training, but I don't know if that's a good thing. I don't know. Like, that's a decision you have to make strategy-wise. Is that long-term? Like, what are you building for the future? Are you wanting to maximize your strength or shore up your weakness? I don't know. And so I would still push back on that immediate thing and say, like, it's good that we know how to do this, but we still don't. That doesn't tell us our answer. We still have to use our brain and think. And obviously, I'm biased this topic. I have a book out in this area, but this is why, I was so fired about this stuff, because I'm like, no, we still have to think. We can't use this very blanket, like, well, okay, I'm a good jumper, I'm a good leaper, but I get tired fast. Okay, therefore I should only do sets of 5. Mm-hmm. No, maybe you should do the exact opposite, or maybe you should. I don't know. The more goes into this conversation than just those things. So use your brains, folks.
Yeah. Okay, absolutely. And if anyone who's performance orientated, then the outcome that they're looking for will dictate the training they do. I suppose the slight difference here is if you're a physique competitor and you just want to, performance is an issue, how you look, then maybe
yes and no, because again, I don't work with them, but I've spoke with several high level like Mr. Olympia and quality like bodybuilders, and there's still that paradigm there of, or predict the juxtaposition of, okay, well, yeah, but maybe if I did say more the opposite training, maybe 2 or 3, 4 years down the road, I'd be in a better spot.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, or because you have a ceiling with your best, right? So you can only get so far with the area. Maybe you've spent more time in the other areas, get there. So I still, like, even with the physique people, I don't know what the right answer is there.
Yeah, it's fascinating subject.
Yeah.
One with plenty of questions to it. Now, well, we're sort of running up on time here. I know you're busy, so I don't want to take too much more of your time. But I could sit here and chat about this stuff all day. So hopefully the listeners are really enjoying it, and I think there's been some fantastic stuff there. We'll just move things on. I got some quick fire questions for you, slightly unrelated to what we've talked about so far, but just so we get a little bit more about you and an insight into what makes Andy tick. So. Let's go through those first. It's either or questions, and first up is pizza or burger.
Ooh, I would say burger if I got to use wild game meat.
Right. Okay. Very specific answer. No one's been quite that specific about that yet so far, but I like the fact that it really got you thinking. Chocolate or peanut butter?
Peanut butter for sure.
Beach holiday or city break?
Oh God, neither.
Just work, right?
No, like I'd rather be in a mountain.
Ah, okay,
I'd
fine.
rather be in Iceland or something like that. I live on the beach and I live in the city, and I hate both of them.
Oh, well, you have that luxury. I've got the city, but not the beach. Okay, and then you're having a steak, rare or well done?
Oh, come on. Oh, shame on you, sir. Did you say well done?
Yeah, I'm waiting. Someone will answer that with that answer. No one has ever answered anything like rare. I think someone hinted at medium rare once, which was, well, I was dubious, but...
Shame on that person.
Right, I'm glad to know you're on the same page.
If anyone says well done, you do not air that episode.
Well, I think
do not allow that person.
We just need to put like an explicit label on the when it's released. And last one of these, eggs, poached or scrambled?
I could do either, but I would say for sure poached if I was able to have some sort of mechanism to sop up the yolk with.
Oh, okay, fine, yeah. Some nice starchy carbs to mop it up with.
Yeah.
So now, next up, can you tell us something that we probably don't know about you? Something, little dark secret you got there, or something unusual?
Something that you don't know about me. Well, plenty, I guess, depending on how you grew up. I don't know. I would say that I'll say one, I am a junkie for history.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I listen to an excessive amount of history podcasts and grammar podcasts. I listen to grammar podcasts and like technical writing things.
That's the thing. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. See, exactly.
Yeah. Well, actually, probably from the last 4 sentences I've put together, you can tell that I don't. But maybe I should invest some time in those. And next up, so you've given us Cody as a recommendation, but I'm going to push my luck a little bit and go for another. So if I've got an open diary book with all the contacts of the world, who should I interview next?
Well, I would say Kevin Murach
Mm-hmm.
from the University of Kentucky, Murach.
Okay.
And Kevin he's not a strength and conditioning junkie, so minus 100 points there. But he's very, very sharp, very personable, very good on the microphone. He studies muscle biology at an extremely high level and is at the top of the food chain regarding understanding the mechanisms that actually induce hypertrophy. And more importantly, things like fiber splitting or hyperplasia.
Right.
So he's done a lot of work recently and published a lot of work in those areas. He doesn't have the ability to do this in human, but he's very good at understanding what would cross over, what wouldn't. He's certainly in touch, not just like a researcher who studies mice and he's completely in the left field. He's a young, strapping, handsome young man. So
just like me, guys, if you're listening, yeah, just like me. So brilliant. All right. Well, thanks very much. I will definitely hit him up to get him on the show. So thanks so much for your time today. Now, everyone will want to know more about you, the services you provide, and what you do. So can you take a moment now to let the listeners know where they can find out more, and where there are some resources, or products, whatever it may be, for them to find out a little bit more.
Sure. The social media is pretty easy to find. Dr. Andy Galpin, Dr. Andy Galpin. I put out most of the stuff on Instagram. Twitter is the faster one though. If you want to get direct links to the studies, it's pretty much all sciencey performance stuff. You can visit my website, andygalpin.com, or it's on YouTube as well. So I try to take, and I'm working through to put basically my entire university education up on those videos for free. There's no newsletter, there's no products to buy. I don't have a subscription to a Research Digest or anything like that. This is literally out there for free. So if you like this stuff, you want to check it out, you can do that. And the reason, for the most part, is, I know a lot of people that are really interested in learning more about the physiology of muscle or nutrition or whatnot, but you don't want to go back to university and pay the fees and sit in classes. It's just super annoying. You want to get straight to the stuff that matters to you, and you don't want 2 years of prereqs and all that garbage, that bunch of classes that the first 6 weeks of the semester don't actually talk about what you want to learn about. So you got to sit through all that shit until the last week when they actually talk about muscle or whatever. So I basically took all the stuff that I think is actually fairly interesting and applicable and put it up there. And so that's up there for anyone to view. And if you enjoy those and you want to contribute, it is attached to a Patreon account, and that's just patreon.com/Andy Galpin. And you can kick in $5 or something like that. And I use that to pay actually the dude who does all the graphics and puts the videos together for me. And then I'll pay my students to do things for me to free up time so I can make that videos.
Okay.
So that's what it's all for. But if not, if you can't afford it or you're a student or whatever, yeah, just keep watching them. They're all up there. So more coming too.
Awesome. Yeah. Phenomenal resource. And you've got your 5-minute physiology ones. So if you want to get kind of the real quick bit of info to get a basic understanding and then develop from there, you can do that, right? You've got your 5. I think there's 20-minute ones, and then there's the even longer, so they can go really in depth.
Yeah, there's the 5-minute, 25-minute, and the 55-minute ones. And the 55-minute ones can be up to like 2.5 hours. And so it's sort of funny because I have a lot of friends that work, professionally online, if you will, and they're all like, oh, I can help you SEO optimize, and I can help you title this and break it up. And if you did this better, you'll get more engagement. And I'm like, I don't give a fuck about that stuff. Like, I'm putting it, and if 13 people watch the video, I really don't give a shit if those 13 people were like, that was awesome. I really don't care. So I don't spend any time trying to play any of those games. And I don't knock people that do. Like, you got to make a living. But I make a living doing what I do. So I literally make the videos that I'm like, man, and if that means I'm going to give you an hour and a half of all this stuff on how a muscle actually grows, well, then it's going up there. And I'm not going to break it up into 4 parts so that I can maximize posts and things like that. It's just there, and I put it up, and if I can answer it in 5 minutes, I'll try to answer it in 5 minutes and be done with it. So it's up there. I go straight to the point most of the time, and the visuals are pretty good, the graphics are pretty good, and well, then they are now. So and it's also hopefully you're getting a sense of, I don't teach undergraduate curriculum like most. So even if you're like, oh, I already had XPhys, I'll know this stuff. Dabble in there. I bet you're going to be like, oh, wow, no one ever taught it like this before.
Yeah.
So,
well, I can vouch for it. I've watched some. They're excellent. They're a great resource, and like you say, they're just up there available for you. So you're a fool if you're not getting on there and you're missing out. So definitely check those out, guys. And from us, that's a wrap. Thanks very much.
Appreciate it, man.
That wraps up today's episode. Thank you so much for investing your time with us. We really appreciate it. If you enjoyed what you heard and took value from it, please do me a favour by heading to iTunes right now, subscribing to the show, and leaving a review. Positive reviews, like 5 stars, hint hint, really help the ranking of the show and will help us to spread the word and keep getting top-class guests on. Make sure to follow Breaking Muscle on social media and me at Tom McCormick, that's TomMaccormick on Instagram. Bye for now,
and I'm looking forward to catching you on the next episode of the Breaking Muscle podcast.